Everyone is asking why there has been no arrest after 63 days. Nobody is stopping to ask the question that the Guthrie family itself decided to answer publicly on March 21st, not through a leak, not through a press conference, but through a written statement they chose to release to the world. Why are investigators asking people in Tucson to search their memories, their camera footage, their old text messages and journal notes, for a specific evening 20 days before Nancy disappeared? The date the family named is January 11th. That is not a date the FBI announced. It is not a date the Pima County Sheriff's Department put on a press release. It is a date that the people who have been receiving information directly from federal investigators decided to place in front of the public, in their own words, because they believe someone in southern Arizona saw something on that evening and does not yet realize what they saw. There is something important to understand about where that date comes from before we go any further, because most coverage has gotten this wrong. When the FBI recovered footage from Nancy's Google Nest camera by extracting residual data from back-end systems, Google initially told investigators that one of the recovered images was possibly from January 11th. That is why authorities began asking neighbors about that specific date, canvassing the Catalina Foothills neighborhood and surrounding areas for any footage or memories tied to that evening. But Google subsequently walked back that statement, telling authorities it could not definitively determine when that image was captured or assign it to any specific date. Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed that reversal to NBC News directly. The date is not confirmed. Google cannot say for certain it was January 11th. And yet the Guthrie family, who speak regularly with FBI investigators, and whose access to case information exceeds what any journalist or commentator is working with, placed January 11th in their public statement anyway. They asked Tucsonans to look specifically at the late evening of that date. They are not guessing. The question this video is built around is the one that follows from that decision. What does the family know about that image? Or about that evening? That Google cannot officially confirm, but that investigators are still treating as significant enough to act on? Nancy Guthrie is an 84-year-old woman who has lived in the Catalina Foothills area north of Tucson for more than 50 years. She was last seen at 9:45 in the evening on January 31st, when her daughter Annie dropped her at home after a family dinner. Many videos about this case get that detail wrong. Her disappearance was reported on February 1st, but the last confirmed sighting of her was the night before. Her pacemaker stopped syncing with her iPhone at 2:28 in the morning. That is the last signal from inside that house. Day 63, no name suspect. $1 million in reward money from her family, and $100,000 from the FBI, both unclaimed. January 11th may not be confirmed, but investigators canvassed for it. Her family referenced it publicly. And there is a second date they also named, one that has received almost no attention at all, that begins to reveal a pattern only visible when you set all three dates side by side. Murder Mystery File is going where that pattern leads. Subscribe now and stay with this, because what the timeline of January and February 2026 is describing about this suspect is something no single piece of coverage has assembled in one place. The date January 11th did not arrive at this investigation through speculation or social media theory. It arrived through a technology company's attempt to help the FBI understand what its own servers had stored, and then through the careful judgment of a family that has been living inside this investigation since the morning their mother did not answer her phone. Here is the sequence as it actually unfolded. When the FBI spent 8 days working with Google to extract residual data from Nancy Guthrie's Nest camera, the images they recovered did not arrive with clean timestamps attached, because the camera had been physically disconnected from the door, carried away from the Catalina Foothills property entirely, and the device itself has never been recovered. What the FBI found was data that had survived in the back end of Google's servers through a combination of the camera's tamper detection mechanism and the specific way that the deletion process works for footage that is marked to go but has not yet been overwritten. In that recovered material, Google initially told investigators that one particular image was possibly from January 11th. That was enough for authorities to begin asking Nancy's neighbors about that specific evening, canvassing door-to-door for footage or memories connected to the late hours of that Saturday night. There was one detail in Google's initial communication that investigators had to weigh very carefully before building anything further on it. Google subsequently told those same investigators that it could not confirm the date. The company walked back its earlier statement, clarifying that the metadata associated with the recovered image was not reliable enough to assign it to January 11th or any other specific date with certainty. Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed that sequence to NBC News, acknowledging that the date remains unverified by the company. The image may be from January 11th. It may not be. The FBI and Google have both declined to say anything further about the timeline publicly. And then the Guthrie family released their statement on March 21st, and they named January 11th anyway, not as a confirmed fact, not as something the FBI had told the public, but as a date they were asking the Tucson community to specifically revisit, alongside the night of January 31st and the early hours of February 1st. They asked people to check camera footage from the late evening of January 11th. They asked people to look through journal entries, text messages, casual observations. They said no detail was too small. That is not a family passing along a rumor. That is a family that has been in direct communication with federal investigators for 63 days, making a deliberate choice about what information to put in front of the public. The question that opens is this: if Google cannot confirm that date, what is the Guthrie family drawing on when they name it? January 11th is not the only date investigators have been asking about, and this is where the picture becomes considerably more specific than most coverage has acknowledged. Neighbors near Nancy's home told NBC News in mid-March that authorities had visited their homes and asked about two distinct dates before the night of her disappearance: January 11th and January 24th. Investigators requested video footage and any other information connected to activity on both of those evenings in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood and the roads leading in and out of it. Brian Fitzgibbons is not a retired law enforcement officer speaking in general terms about missing persons cases from a television studio. He is the Director of Operations at USPA, Nationwide Security, a firm that provides protective intelligence and security operations for high-stakes situations, and his analytical work sits at the intersection of physical surveillance, criminal behavior, and threat assessment. Fitzgibbons analyzed the three dates publicly on the Crime Stories podcast hosted by Nancy Grace and said, something that deserves to be considered slowly. January 11th is a Saturday. January 24th is a Friday. January 31st, the night Nancy was last seen alive and well, is a Friday, and the early hours of February 1st, when her pacemaker went silent at 2:28 in the morning, fall on a Saturday. Every single incident investigators are examining occurred on a weekend night. Fitzgibbons called this pattern extremely probative. The word probative means it tends to prove something. What it tends to prove is a behavioral consistency that is visible only when you step back far enough to see all three dates together, rather than treating each one as an isolated event. There is something specific about a person who operates exclusively on weekend nights in a residential neighborhood more than 50 years established, where residents know their neighbors and notice what is out of place, that Fitzgibbons flagged directly. Is this someone who was somewhere else during the week? Someone working in a different city or region Monday through Friday, traveling to Tucson specifically on weekends to be in that neighborhood, at that house, on those specific evenings? That is a question the investigation has not answered publicly, and it is a question that cannot be answered without knowing who this person is. But the pattern itself, 3 weekend nights across 3 weeks, is a data point. It is not random. The FBI's attention in recent weeks has moved to something that connects the reconnaissance pattern to a more specific possibility than a distant traveler acting alone. According to News Nation correspondent Brian Enton, who has been reporting from Tucson since the earliest days of this investigation, federal agents returned to the Catalina Foothills neighborhood to ask questions about two things: a property near Nancy's home that had been vacated shortly before her disappearance, and several homes in the area that were under active construction during January 2026. Investigators reportedly requested the names of contractors and workers who had been present in the neighborhood in the days and weeks leading up to February 1st. That is not a broad canvas. That is a targeted question about specific people who had a documented, legitimate reason to be in that neighborhood during the exact window the weekend pattern falls within, who would have been visible to residents without raising concern, and who would have had repeated, natural opportunities to observe the layout of the streets, the routines of the people who live there, and the placement of security cameras on the homes they passed every day. The bridge bomb is this: a person who was already in that neighborhood during January for reasons that would not have alarmed anyone, watching from a position no one would question, learning the rhythms of a house where an 84-year-old woman lived alone and kept the same schedule week after week. That person would not have needed to travel from a distance. They would already have been there. The FBI's request for contractor names is the single most specific investigative thread that has surfaced in weeks, and it has not been confirmed by official law enforcement statements. But it has not been denied. And in a case where investigators are not saying they are close, not saying they are stalled, and not saying anything at all about the direction of the DNA analysis or the ransom note authentication, that specific inquiry into that specific group of people is a thread being pulled for a reason. Look at the footage the FBI released on February 10th, and hold one detail that the network coverage largely passed over when the images went public. In the formal description released on February 12th, the FBI described the suspected kidnapper as a male, 5'9" to 5'10", average build. But the description also noted something more identifying than a height range: a black mustache. Not a full beard, not a general reference to facial hair. A black mustache, visible in the recovered footage, specific enough for the FBI's forensic team to include in an official physical description after their Operational Technology Division used the fixed points of Nancy's front doorway to calculate precise measurements. A black mustache is not a description of a masked stranger. It is a description of a specific face. It is a feature that a neighbor, a coworker, a family member, someone who passed this person in a parking lot or a hardware store or a job site in January would recognize if they saw the FBI's description and paused long enough to think about the people they know. The FBI published that detail because it narrows the field, because somewhere in the greater Tucson area, there is someone who knows a man with a black mustache who matches that height and build, who is unaccounted for on weekend nights in January, and who has not yet made the connection between what they know and what the FBI is looking for. If that description fits someone in your life, someone you have been thinking about while watching this case, the number to call is 1-800-CALL-FBI. The family reward is $1 million. It is real, it is waiting, and it is the reason the next tip could be the one that changes the direction of this investigation entirely. Subscribe to Murder Mystery File if you are not already, and turn on notifications, because the thread connecting the weekend pattern to the contractor inquiry to that physical description is not finished pulling yet, and what it pulls toward when you hold all three together is the question at the center of this case that nobody has been able to answer for 63 days. How did this person know enough about Nancy Guthrie's life to plan what he planned? And when exactly did that knowledge begin? There is a timeline detail buried inside this investigation that almost no one has stopped to map out precisely, and it matters more than it appears on the surface. Nancy Guthrie was reported missing on February 1st. The FBI spent the following 8 days working to recover footage from her camera. They released the images of the masked suspect on February 10th. And yet investigators did not begin asking Nancy's neighbors specifically about January 11th and January 24th until mid-March, more than 6 weeks after Nancy disappeared, and more than a month after the footage that may have prompted those questions was already in their possession. 6 weeks is a long time in a kidnapping case, where the first 48 hours are understood to be the most critical window for recovery. That gap does not necessarily mean the investigation was idle during those weeks. Federal investigations run on multiple parallel tracks, and the absence of public announcements does not reflect the absence of activity inside a 24-hour command center processing thousands of tips alongside subpoena returns, lab results, and digital forensic analysis. But it does mean that the specific line of inquiry connecting the weekend visits to the neighborhood canvas was either not pursued, not prioritized, or not actionable until something changed in the information available to investigators in late February or early March, and whatever changed has not been disclosed publicly. There is one thread that appears to have shifted the focus of the investigation toward that neighborhood in a new way, and it connects to a property that was sitting empty in the Catalina foothills area during January 2026. According to News Nation correspondent Brian Enton, whose on-the-ground reporting from Tucson has produced some of the most specific investigative details to emerge from this case, federal agents returned to the neighborhood in recent weeks and focused attention on a vacant property near Nancy's home, a residence that had been vacated shortly before her disappearance, as well as several homes in the surrounding area that were under active construction during the month of January. Agents reportedly requested the names of contractors and workers who had been present in those locations in the weeks leading up to February 1st. That request has not been confirmed by official law enforcement statements, and the FBI has not commented on it. But it has also not been disputed. And the specificity of the inquiry, not a general canvass of the neighborhood, but a targeted request for a particular category of people with documented presence at particular addresses, suggests investigators have a reason to believe that someone with a working connection to that neighborhood in January may have information relevant to what happened there. The vacant property angle opens a question that the weekend pattern alone cannot answer, which is this: how does a person conduct 3 reconnaissance visits to a residential neighborhood on weekend evenings without being noticed by anyone who has come forward? A neighborhood like Catalina foothills, established and residential, where people know which cars belong and which do not, where a stranger standing in front of a specific house on a Saturday night would be visible. To anyone who happened to pass that kind of neighborhood should generate memories. And yet in 63 days, no one has publicly reported seeing someone matching the suspect's description in January before the night Nancy disappeared. That absence of witnesses has two possible explanations. The first is that someone did see him and has not yet connected what they saw to what they are seeing in the FBI's released footage. The second is that he was present in a context that made his presence unremarkable, a context that a vacant property and active construction sites would provide without effort. There is a second complication running alongside the reconnaissance thread that has received less scrutiny than it deserves, because the story of the ransom notes in this case is considerably more tangled than the initial report suggested. Derek Colella, a 42-year-old man from California, was charged with sending a fraudulent ransom demand to Annie Guthrie and her husband, a hoax communication that was identified and separated from the authentic investigation relatively quickly. But the ransom notes that arrived at TMZ and at two Tucson television stations in the days after Nancy disappeared are an entirely different matter, and 63 days later, the FBI has neither confirmed them as authentic nor dismissed them as fabrications. Savannah Guthrie revealed in her interview with Hoda Kotb that her family received what she described as credible ransom demands, and that the family recorded video messages in response to those demands, video that was sent to whoever was holding Nancy, or whoever claimed to be. No proof of life has been publicly confirmed. The deadlines contained in both ransom notes have passed. Nothing followed either deadline. And the family, who recorded responses to these communications and were apparently willing to engage with whoever sent them, has received nothing in return that they have been able to share with the public. They are not saying the notes are real. They are not saying the notes were fabricated by someone exploiting the case for reasons unconnected to Nancy. They are saying almost nothing about the ransom notes at all now, and neither is the FBI. In a case where the family has been consistent and public about almost every other aspect of their search, that specific silence around those communications is a choice that reflects the sensitivity of an open channel that may still be active. Nancy Guthrie turned 84 in January, 3 weeks before she vanished, and she had celebrated it the way she celebrated most things in her life. In Tucson, surrounded by the routines and the people she had built her world around over 5 decades in that city, the weekly church service she watched online with a friend, the dinners with her daughters, the quiet familiarity of a neighborhood she had known long enough to remember when the trees lining those streets were newly planted. She carried her medication home from Annie's house on the night of January 31st because she expected to take it the next morning, the same as every other morning, in the same kitchen where she had taken it 1,000 times before. If you are holding any prayer for her today, any hope at all that she is still somewhere in this world and that someone will do the right thing, leave that in the comments. Amen. Whatever word you carry. Because she is not a case file or a timestamp or a detail in a criminal profile. She is a person who has been gone for 63 days, and the people who love her cannot grieve because they cannot stop hoping. 3 things sit at the center of what we know and have not yet been able to connect into a single answer. The weekend pattern points towards someone with a schedule and a reason to be elsewhere during the week. The contractor inquiry points towards someone who may have had a legitimate presence in that neighborhood during January. And the footage itself, the way the masked figure moves through that front entrance, the unhurried certainty of his approach, the knowledge of exactly where the shrub sits beside the door in the dark, points towards someone who had already stood in that exact spot before, in daylight, in a context no one found worth remarking on. When you hold all 3 of those against each other, the profile that begins to take shape is not the profile of a stranger who researched a neighborhood from a distance. It is the profile of someone who was already there, already visible, already part of the ordinary landscape of that street in January 2026, and who made a decision somewhere in those 3 weekend visits that he was going to come back one more time, with different equipment, and not leave without Nancy. That is the frame that Peak 2 is going to examine with every confirmed and reported piece of evidence this investigation has produced. Because the question this case has been building toward for 63 days is not only who it is, when, and where, and for how long before the night of January 31st was this person already watching. Here is what we know with certainty about the suspected kidnapper of Nancy Guthrie. And here is what remains reported but unconfirmed, because you deserve to know the difference, and because in a case where speculation has been moving faster than verified information for 2 months, that distinction is not a formality. It is the difference between building an understanding of what happened and filling a vacuum with guesswork. What law enforcement has confirmed publicly? A male suspect approached Nancy Guthrie's front door in the early morning hours of February 1st, wearing a mask, gloves, and a holstered firearm, carrying a 25-liter Ozark Trail backpack, and deliberately obstructing the camera mounted at her entrance before physically removing it from the doorframe and taking it with him. The FBI, using forensic measurements of the fixed points of Nancy's arched front entryway, determined his height to be between 5'9" and 5'10", with an average build, and noted a black mustache as a visible identifying feature. His DNA, recovered from the property, returned no match in the CODIS national database of more than 26 million profiles. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has officially stated that investigators are not ruling out the possibility that more than one person was involved in Nancy's disappearance. The family has confirmed they received ransom demands they described as credible and recorded video responses. The FBI has confirmed the investigation is active, and that investigative genetic genealogy is being pursued as a tool. What is reported by credentialed journalists and experts, but has not been confirmed by official law enforcement. Statements: the possibility that a prior visit to Nancy's property occurred before the night of January 31st, connected to the image recovered by the FBI from back-end systems that Google initially suggested may have been from January 11th, before walking back that assertion. The FBI's renewed focus on a nearby vacant property and the names of contractors and workers active in the neighborhood during January, reported by NewsNation's Brian Entin. The presence of what appears to be a handheld communication device, an antenna, consistent with a walkie-talkie visible on the suspect's person in the released footage, identified by former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer in a post on X. The behavioral analysis connecting the FBI 3 weekend dates to a profile of someone with a specific schedule and potentially a point of origin outside Tucson. Now hold the walkie-talkie detail, because it is the reported element of this case that has received the least sustained analytical attention relative to what it would mean if it is accurate. Jennifer Coffindaffer is not a social media personality offering commentary on a case she has been following from her living room. She is a retired FBI special agent with years of operational experience, whose public analysis of the Nancy Guthrie footage has been cited by multiple national outlets, precisely because her training gives her the ability to read surveillance video in ways that differ from a civilian viewer. When Coffindaffer looked at the footage of the suspect approaching Nancy's front door and identified what she described as an antenna, the visible signature of a handheld walkie-talkie carried on his body, she drew a specific conclusion from it. This person was in active communication with at least one other individual during the approach. She wrote that he definitively had an accomplice, and in a subsequent interview with Newsweek, she acknowledged the possibility while still leaning toward multiple people being involved, explaining that abductions of this nature typically require assistance, someone to manage the victim, someone to control the destination, someone who is positioned and waiting when the primary actor moves. A walkie-talkie is not an incidental accessory. A person planning a home invasion kidnapping who brings a walkie-talkie to the front door of his target is operating with a communication infrastructure that was assembled deliberately. Cell phones leave tower records. Walkie-talkies do not. If this device was chosen over a phone for the approach, that choice reflects an awareness of digital forensics sophisticated enough to anticipate the investigative methods that would follow. That sophistication sits at the center of the sharpest analytical disagreement this case has produced between two people whose professional experience with criminal behavior is not in question. Jim Clemente spent his career at the FBI as a supervisory special agent and criminal profiler, whose work focused specifically on abduction cases, the rarest and most operationally complex category of violent crime the Bureau investigates. When Clemente reviewed the available evidence in the Nancy Guthrie case, he told Newsweek that the suspect demonstrated what he called forensic sophistication, but was not police or military trained, and in his assessment had likely not done something like this before. The footprints of an organized first-time offender, someone who understood the principles of avoiding detection well enough to plan carefully, but whose execution revealed the gaps that come from learning rather than from experience. Matt Murphy spent his career as a prosecutor in Orange County, California, sitting across courtrooms from people who had committed serious violent crimes, watching juries evaluate the evidence that law enforcement assembled against them. Murphy offered a prediction publicly that points in a different direction. He said he would bet his bottom dollar that the suspect in this case would turn out to be a known individual in the Pima County jail system, someone with prior contact with law enforcement, a prior record, a face that the people who work in that courthouse have seen before. These two assessments do not cancel each other out. They are asking different questions. Clemente is asking what the behavioral evidence suggests about this person's prior criminal history, specifically related to kidnapping. Murphy is asking what the statistical profile of violent offenders in the Pima County area suggests about where this person is most likely to come from. A person can be a first-time kidnapper and still have a prior record for other offenses. A person can have forensic sophistication absorbed from documentary exposure, internet research, or proximity to law enforcement without having been trained professionally. The question genetic genealogy may eventually answer is not which expert is right about this suspect's psychology. It is which name in a family tree, traceable through the DNA left at Nancy's home, leads investigators to a face. The science behind investigative genetic genealogy does not require a direct DNA sample from the suspect himself. It requires that someone in his extended family, a cousin, a half-sibling, an aunt or uncle he may never have met, has submitted their own DNA to a consumer database like 23andMe or Ancestry. That relative's profile creates a node in a family tree, and forensic genealogists work outward from that node, building branches, cross-referencing public records, narrowing a field of hundreds of possible relatives, down to a cluster of individuals who match the age, sex, and geographic profile of the person investigators are looking for. The Golden State Killer was identified through a distant relative's profile in a public database after more than 40 years of unsuccessful investigation. The DNA recovered from Nancy Guthrie's property, which does not belong to her, or to anyone in her immediate circle, is a thread that does not disappear. It waits. Former FBI Special Agent Jason Pack, speaking about this case, put it plainly: the absence of a named suspect does not mean the absence of progress. The most consequential investigative work almost never happens in front of a camera. And the DNA recovered from that property, he said, is still one of the biggest threads left to pull. The Pima County Sheriff's Department is not saying they are close. They are not saying they are stalled. They are not saying anything specific about where the genetic genealogy work stands, what the subpoena returns have produced, what the contractor inquiry has surfaced, or what the FBI's analysis of the ransom note communications has determined. They are saying the investigation continues, and that it will continue until Nancy is located, or all leads are exhausted. In 63 days, that statement has not changed in any substantive way. And in an investigation of this magnitude, with these resources, that specific and sustained silence is not an absence of activity. It is the sound of work that has not yet produced something the investigators are willing to announce. Nancy Guthrie chose Tucson the way people choose a city when they intend to stay, not as a temporary arrangement, not as a convenience, but as a decision about where to build a life, made more than 50 years ago when her children were young and the Catalina foothills were a place where you could plant roots deep enough to last. She knew the roads of that neighborhood the way you know roads you have driven for decades, without thinking about them, the way they become part of the geography of your own body. She had friends in that city who expected to see her face on a screen every Sunday morning for a church service she never missed. When she did not appear on February 1st, the friend who was waiting did not wait long before calling. That is what 50 years of showing up builds people who notice when you do not. She has now been missing for 63 days. The gray Range Rover seized from the parking lot of a nearby Culver's restaurant in the early days of the investigation has never been publicly connected to a person or cleared from the investigation's scope. The ransom note communications that the family described as credible have not been authenticated or dismissed. The DNA mixed with other biological material at the crime scene is in a laboratory being separated strand by strand in the hope that what emerges will finally attach a name to the face in that footage. Two questions do not have answers, and they are the questions that have been sitting at the center of this case since the morning of February 1st. If the walkie-talkie is real, and there was someone at the other end of that communication during the approach, where is that person now, and what do they know? And if the weekend pattern means what the behavioral analysis suggests, it means if this person was in that neighborhood in January with a schedule and a reason and a level of access that allowed him to stand in front of Nancy's door more than once without drawing attention, then the community that contains him, the people who share his week, his workplace, his family, his daily life, are also waiting without knowing they are waiting. The investigation is asking them to remember. The family is asking them to look. And $1 million is the price of doing the right thing. What the Guthrie family is living through, the particular cruelty of not being able to grieve because the possibility of hope has not yet been extinguished, is something that the behavioral science of predatory crime can help us understand, not to make it easier, but because understanding the pattern that preceded February 1st is the most direct path to preventing the next one. The behavior this investigation has been documenting across January 2026 has a clinical name in criminal psychology. It is called pre-offense reconnaissance, and it is among the most reliable behavioral markers that distinguishes an organized offender from a disorganized one. An organized offender selects a target deliberately, returns to assess conditions before acting, monitors the target's routines without making contact, and chooses a moment to act based on accumulated knowledge rather than impulse. Every element of that description is present in what investigators have been piecing together about the weeks before Nancy disappeared: the repeated weekend visits, the knowledge of the camera's subscription status, the familiarity with the exact position of a shrub beside a front door in the dark. What criminal psychology also tells us is that pre-offense behavior leaves traces in the social environment of the offender that are visible in retrospect. The person conducting reconnaissance is not invisible. They are simply operating in a context that makes their presence appear ordinary. They are seen, they are noticed. The information is simply not yet connected to the investigation. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer said directly that she believed the case would ultimately be broken by someone who knows this person, coming forward a family member, a partner, someone who has seen the footage and felt something shift in their understanding of a person they thought they knew well. That is not a speculative pathway. It is the most common resolution in organized predatory crime cases, where physical evidence alone has not yet been sufficient. The practical implication of everything this investigation has surfaced is specific and actionable for anyone watching this video whose life intersects with the Tucson area or with someone who travels there on weekends. If you know a man with a black mustache, between 5'9" and 5'10", with an average build, who was in the greater Tucson area on weekend evenings in January 2026, and whose whereabouts or behavior during that period you have thought about since this case became national news, that thought deserves a phone call. Not a post, not a theory in a comment section. A call to 1-800-CALL-FBI, or a submission through tips.fbi.gov. The reward is $1 million from the Guthrie family and $100,000 from the FBI. Those numbers exist because the family understands that the person with the answer may need something more than a moral reason to come forward. The investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance began this video with a question the family itself planted in public on March 21st, a question about a date that Google raised and then walked back, a date that investigators have been quietly building a behavioral case around for weeks without announcing what they have found. That question, when did this person first come to that door, and how long before he took her had he already decided he would, is the question that the weekend pattern, the contractor inquiry, the reconnaissance profile, and the genetic genealogy thread are all working toward from different angles at the same time. Murder Mystery File will be here when any one of those threads produces a public result. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and if this video has given you a framework for thinking about this case that you did not have before, share it with someone who has been following Nancy's story. The tip line needs the right call. It only takes one. And tell us in the comments if he came to that door 3 times. What was he learning on each visit that he did not already know? 3 visits, 3 weekends. And Nancy Guthrie is still missing.